Hi all, welcome. I'm really excited to be joining. I was recently at Heriot-Watt, so got to get a flavor of the sense of campus, which was wonderful, and meet a few, some of you possibly, and some of your colleagues. And so I hope this is interesting. I plan to talk for about half an hour and have plenty of time for Q&A. So please do queue up questions as you go along, and also write them down to save them for when we go through, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of what I'm talking about today. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to discuss a brief sort of background on sort of student engagement, talk about some research I've done on student expectations and how that leads into the gains students get from their higher education experience. Talk a bit about partnership and policy as mechanisms to support student engagement, and conclude with a little bit of chat about belonging in AI. So hopefully all of this together will help sort of draw in with the conference theme, and help you get some ideas on thinking about belonging in your own context. So when I talk about student engagement, this is what I'm talking about. So this is different than some conceptions which might solely be about student representatives, but this definition of student engagement really draws on what each individual student does in relation to their own higher education experience. And that what we know from decades of research is that the time and effort students devote to activities that we know are linked to the desired outcomes from higher education, is what leads to success. But of course, it's not students alone. It's also what institutions do to incentivize and induce students to participate in these activities. These can be kind of wild and fun activities like field trips and labs, but it might also just be going to lectures. So how students and staff who work at the institution together collaborate to support students in this is what we know leads to success in higher education. And although this is an extremely dated reference, it's not that I just haven't been doing my homework for the last few decades, but I think these 7 principles of higher education haven't really been improved since we know them. They're just kind of the fundamentals of what we know good higher education looks like. We need contact between staff and students, and we know now that can be mediated digitally, but students need ways to contact the staff that they're working with. They need to feel that they have staff who care about them and their progression. We need reciprocity and cooperation among students. Again, that can be in person or online, but students, when they feel part of a learning community, they feel connected with their other students, they feel like they're working together and not solely in competition with each other, leads to better outcomes. Encourage active learning. We know just lecturing at students isn't what makes them feel like they belong. They don't take much in. It's not particularly fun for us either. Students need prompt feedback. They need to be able to action feedback in relation to how they're progressing on their learning journey. Time on task. This is a brilliant one. Students need to understand how much time they need to spend on higher education, on assignments, and helping give students some tips and clues about how much time they should be spending on different activities is really important. I know in my own institutional context at Imperial, sometimes we give a course sheet, and in your mind as a professor, you might think you might spend about an hour on that. And sometimes we might have students spending 10 or 15 hours really trying to perfect a piece of coursework. And it really throws them off because it's not kind of, there's sort of a bell curve to the time on task, that too much isn't a good thing either, or they're not prioritizing the right things. It's really important to communicate high expectations, and that's really setting that bar high for students. If you kind of let them know they can skate through without doing much work, fancy, that's what they'll do. And finally, it's really important to respect diverse talents and ways of learning. So I raise these fundamental principles as I really think this is what will lead to belonging. I think sometimes we like to overcomplicate things in higher education, but we just really need to go back to how do we kind of take modern technology, the reality of our students today, the current status of higher education in the sector, but still remember that these are fundamentally what we need to deliver on in higher education. When we think about factors that influence student engagement, we know it's combinations of students' behaviors, what they do, their pre-university experiences, what they come in with, the institutional conditions, who are your students? What's the reality? Did they just drop their 3 kids off at childcare and rush into a lecture, or did they roll out of bed, having been studying late the night before? It's sort of understanding who your students are. As an instructor, thinking about your teaching and learning approaches and being a proper reflective practitioner, and actually putting time and effort into thinking, is how I'm approaching my teaching, delivering on what I want for my students. Thinking about what are the goals for students for their post-university outcomes. I know in my own context, sometimes we have a danger that some of the professors are really teaching students how to be future academics. But in reality, there's not that many academic jobs, or that's not the reality for a lot of students. So we need to know what is it that they want to go on to do, what sort of jobs are available for them, and how do we support them in that? How do we have a solid support system? And really thinking about the fundamental principles of engagement. So I'd like you, if you feel like sharing, if you're feeling energetic at 9 a.m. London time, please do write in the chat factors that you think influence student engagement in your classroom. When do you feel that kind of buzzy feeling? Leave a lecture. It could even be a big lecture hall and you think, oh, wow, that was really exciting. The students really enjoyed that. Or you leave a seminar thinking, wow, they kind of raised points I hadn't even thought about yet. So we can also discuss this in the Q&A, but I'd like you to reflect a bit on what you think influences student engagement. Also, some of the challenges you might face of what sort of seems like today was just, sort of a really off day, or that module's just not really delivering on what I want it to. Because it'll help you sort of think about what you can do to improve that. Because we know engagement's sort of fundamental for belonging. But I also do want to let you off the hook a bit. Student engagement is not just about more staff time. It doesn't, you're not sort of off the hook by saying, I'm just really busy, I don't have time to do this. So the default is, students might have less than experience. Staff with student is only one form of engagement. We also need to be really intentional about how we support student with student engagement. And I know we're sort of getting onto the tail end of some of the students who started higher education during the COVID period, but some students don't know how to connect to other students. They don't know how to sort of form study groups. I've certainly talked to even, second year students well into their second year kind of going, I see other students kind of hanging out together and I don't really know how to be part of that. So how do we help support those connections, especially if we have really diverse students who might not have as many shared experiences coming in? How do we link students with the community? That's both within the institution and the wider communities that our institutions are part of. Some people kind of think this is all fluffy. Students go to higher education to learn. Engagement is also students connecting with the content of what they're learning and the process of what they're learning. So it's not all about social, and that kind of gets off the hook of thinking this isn't just all about a whole bunch of outgoing people having deep conversations under a beautiful autumnal tree that we see on the cover of institutional brochures. It's very much also about how students are engaging with their learning and how it's made relevant for them. We can also think about students with mentors. And again, these might be staff mentors, peer mentors, mums and dads schemes within institutions. But I really want you to think about opening up that engagement isn't sort of a one way. It's not all on staff. It's really much more of a whole institution-wide approach to working with students. And engagement is certainly a culture and attitude fostered towards students led by staff. So I think having that orientation of thinking, if the students aren't engaging, you can't just kind of throw your hands in the air and be like, why don't they know how to go to higher education and what they're supposed to do? It's sort of our job as teachers to help support them in that. So I'm just going to briefly touch on a couple of research projects I've actually done with the Quality Assurance Agency. One sort of an older study on student expectations of higher education, and some more recent research on measures of educational gain to sort of get at this idea of what are some of these outcomes we're trying to capture that we think student engagement will sort of lead to. When we think about some of student expectations, although this study is a little dated, I still think it's quite timeful in terms of, I don't really think this has changed. We have student perceptions of value and what they want to get out from their higher education. We have student expectations of the learning environment, and they have clear benchmarks for what they need in place. They need a timetable that functions. They need technology that works. They need rooms that are suitable. They need, staff they can understand. And that's that kind of clear benchmarks that if those aren't in place, students can't kind of continue on with their learning in the way they want to. Students have high expectations for their employability, and I think it's something staff don't talk to students enough about. What sort of industries are students aware of? What kind of activities are they aiming for? How are they going about that search? How are you as a staff member aware of what jobs students go on to? How do we think about evaluation, feedback, and what's most important to students is feed forward. So how do I get, not just kind of the essay you wrote was a bit rubbish, or your maths was wrong on that problem set, but really what do students need to work on and focus on so that they improve in the future? And I think sometimes we forget that's really what students find most helpful for their learning. When we think about staff, it's really important the sort of attributes, practices, and attitudes. I was speaking to a student actually who was attending Leeds Beckett yesterday, who just said, man, my researcher is so boring, and he did this research and it was so dry. And I thought, well, sometimes academics are able to sort of translate, their research and make it really exciting. And the student goes, well, my professor failed to do that royally. So I think it's about what really excites students is how we take our passion, for research and help translate that into something that really makes the subject come alive for students. There's also concerns from students about equity of opportunity. And this is a tricky balance between how do you personalize students' educational experience, possibly give them different modes of assessment, give them flexibility on deadlines if they need it, but also standardize the course enough so that it feels fair to students. I've certainly spoke to students who kind of said, more than half the class got extra time on turning their assignment in. That just doesn't feel fair anymore. And I don't feel like it was right what happened to me. And really importantly, although I put it last, is that transition into higher education and how we're really proactive in thinking about how we support students in their entry into higher education and understanding that actually a lot of students don't really know what it means to go to higher education. They don't know, quote unquote, how to go to higher education. And we really need to support them and kind of set some of those really high expectations right when they start. I shared this map. This was from some of the research. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is the triangle at the bottom middle of this student's sort of map of their experience of a student going, why am I doing this? Am I going to get a job? And how am I going to pay for this? And this is for a student who kind of took the jump to go to higher education, but feels really unsure about what they're getting out of it, why they're there. And that real strong sense of, I'm trying to aim towards something, but I'm not clear if the courses that I'm on, if the activities that I'm undertaking are helping me support me in this. And what I think is really important to kind of reflect on when we think about what these students want are that feedback can be both a form of engagement for students and a mechanism of enhancement. And we really need to think about how we listen to our students and how they're getting on with their course. But for us to be able to listen to them, we have to make sure that we ask them about their experience through a variety of different mechanisms and certainly make this an active and ongoing cycle. I think while it's useful that there are QA mechanisms within institutions to sort of capture this on, through things like module evaluation or annual reporting, it's really important as a teacher to have more informal, regular, ongoing ways to communicate with your students and understand what's happening. And for students, it's really important that they feel there's a process for them to feedback and they're aware of different mechanisms. Even if they choose not to engage, if they know that they can, they're much more satisfied and they do feel much happier than even if they have nothing to complain about, but they don't know where they would go if they did. So it's really important, that attitude to kind of be open to students and how we position that. So drawing these themes together, if we think about engagement as the process for sort of how we get students to participate in their studies, how do we kind of measure the effectiveness of that when we think about the outcomes of higher education? And it really comes down to questions about what we want to measure, which I think fundamentally opens up the idea of, well, we have to measure what we value. That's what we do in life. And so we have to think about what's the purpose of higher education. And we can sort of get off the hook sometimes and say, oh, the government measures all the wrong things. We're always chasing league tables and we know they're rubbish. But we can also think about what are our own ideas on the purpose of higher education and how do we capture outcomes relative to those. So we have agency in this too. So we have to think about what's the purpose and what's valued. What are your students' expectations of higher education? What do you think they're trying to get out? Is it just a degree? Are they trying to learn their subject? Are they just trying to get a job? What do we think graduates should be able to know and do? I'd like you to sort of reflect on this. Again, if you're feeling like taking this spirit of engagement quite high, please do pop in the chat some thoughts on, either what you think the purpose of higher education is, or particularly useful metrics that you think sort of really capture when you feel like your students are learning, or what you feel like is that sense of, I feel like I've done a good job if X happens. So how do we kind of think both formally and informally about how we capture the outcomes of higher education? It really leads to questions about what is success. For some people, it's this idea of leveling the playing field, a feeling like there's students with diverse backgrounds coming in, and our goal is to sort of minimize gaps that students might have based on prior experience. For some people, it's about degree outcome. Best students get the first. It's really a sign of how students do well. For some people, it's much more about the effort put in. This is my perennial award in every sport I've ever done. I always got an A for effort and didn't really win the gold medal in the end, but they said, wow, you really did try hard. When you think about, a lot of league tables, they're based much more on employment outcomes or salary outcomes. And we do know that drives a lot of student behavior. When you think more fundamentally about the sector, it might be the return on investment. So again, we'll have different answers to this question of what is success, depending on if your perspective is coming from students, staff, academics, senior management within the institution, or governments that fund higher education. And I think it's really important to think about what would you measure for what you value in higher education? And do you communicate that to students? Do you communicate that to your fellow colleagues? What sort of measures matter to you? Is it the number of students who go on to PhD programs? Is it the jobs they go into? Is it just that they've learned their subject? So I think it's important for us to reflect on what we think students should get out, have those conversations with students, and that can really help us sort of align our teaching and think about our courses in a way that helps make them really come alive for students, because it really makes them feel like I'm not just sitting here for I don't know what reason, but it makes them feel like what they're doing in the classroom really links with what they're aiming to get out of their higher education experience. So what does some of this mean for our teaching and learning? There's strong relationships with the sort of educational gains that we think we're trying to get from higher education and ideas of things like assessment and feedback. Is what we think about the fundamental outcomes. Do we think that should replace traditional assessment and feedback that we have? When you look at the medical discipline, they developed what's called the medical licensing assessment, which is essentially a high stakes end of course final exam. You have to pass it to become a doctor. So in a way, what a lot of institutions have sort of aligned their assessment and feedback to this test. So it's really kind of thinking that, is that authentic assessment or is that actually taken away? So how do we think about those outcomes that we want? And is that aligned with what our assessment and feedback practices are? But what does that also look like in relation to the wider professions and industries that students are going into? When we think about the relationship with quality assurance, we can think about aspects like external examining. Are there additional aspects other than marks of students' work that you think are important to reflect on your course when we think about these fundamental aspects of quality assurance within our institutions, which is our way of accounting for the success of higher education? Can some of this be used to streamline bureaucracy? I brought up this example from the Architects Registration Board, the ARB. So they recently sort of restructured the whole architecture qualifications because they were very limiting for diverse students to come in. And somehow they managed to create a really sweet spot of having a course with some of the longest time you had to spend in academia with some of the lowest starting salaries of any profession. So that's not ideally where students want to be placed. So they really sort of restructured the whole approach to entering the field of architecture based on what they thought were the important gains that students needed to make for higher education and how they could variously account for those along students' journeys so that they could increase multiple pathways into the profession. When we think about students learning, we can think about educational gains as being part of a way to communicate to students that that's a mechanism they can use to help track their own education. So important to think of what metrics might be captured for belonging and engagement with the data that we get out of students' learning management systems. And what we did at Imperial when we did some work with students was they really wanted to have ways to personalize dashboards that reflected what they individually wanted to get out from higher education. Some wanted to know just what was the bare minimum they needed to do to pass their courses. Others wanted to set different marks for different modules they were in, depending on their levels of interest and where they felt like they were going, and sort of be able to measure their progress because they felt like their learning was a bit of a trade-off of where they could put their effort. And they wanted to sort of maximize success in what they thought mattered. When we think about educational gain and how we enhance our own practice, The dashboards I mentioned can be a way to support student learning and help give them some agency in thinking about how they reflect on what they've learned. I included a nice little graph, which was from one of our draft dashboards that we've developed at Imperial. And as you can see, there's a stark line. I'll give everybody one guess about when you think the final exam was in relation to this data. So you can see there's a lot of students who only access some of the core course material just before the exam. But I think what's also shocking is in this graph, we have about 35, maybe 40% of students who've never logged on to the VLE. I mean, I know there's some exceptions, some students sort of share resources with other students, but there's some students that aren't engaging with this content at all. And I think what we can do when we start to dig into some of these digital trails that we've left with students and the ways they interact with their courses, that opens up a time. And this data shouldn't just be looked at and, sort of pondered over, but it's a way to engage with students and say, why aren't you looking at this? Or did you log in sort of once and then never again and downloaded the material? Are you working with someone else? Do you not have a device? Do you know there's might be mechanisms on campus to borrow one? And it's really kind of exploring with students, kind of saying, do you actually understand there's material on there that you sort of need to pass this course? And use some of these mechanisms as sort of reflective pedagogical tools to get students to think about how they're engaging with their learning. It also gives us opportunities to evaluate classroom interventions. If you try something new, try something different, bit of an innovative pedagogy, does that sort of lead to upticks or changes in the data? And how does this also feed into the scholarship of teaching and learning and ways that we can use some of this data to help us reflect on how we're teaching and how that is impacting how students engage with their course? How can we think about the course experience as a way to facilitate students' identity and belonging? Might it be through mechanisms that they work together or separately? And what does it mean to kind of try and bridge that way of a lot of students feeling quite isolated in their higher education experience now? And how do we also think about this in relation to target institutional initiatives, which are a driving passion for many academics in higher ed, including eliminating awarding gaps across diverse student characteristics, and using some of this data to check, are students seeming to have different patterns of belonging on your course in relation to different characteristics, and what might be some of the causes of that? When we think about empowering students, it's thinking about students as agents of their own data. So not thinking about this data that students have on their educational experience as something that we as sort of, big brother watches over students and sort of report on them and let them know, we know what they've been up to in mysterious ways. But students should fundamentally have all the same access to data that staff do about them. And that students should be able to sort of see this, reflect on it, and be able to have a conversation with staff about sort of, what happened? You're kind of absent for a couple of weeks. Is there anything you want to talk about? Did you have some problems? And push students towards relevant support services within the institution. But this awareness, often I find when I talk to students about it, they just go, oh, wow, I haven't really thought about how much I've been studying. And actually looking at some of this data makes me think maybe I should be studying a bit more, or maybe I should think about where I'm putting sort of some of my time and effort in relation to my learning. We can also think about these type of analytics and the data we get out from students' experiences, and how a lot of the new adaptations of AI are sort of supporting students. I know at Imperial, some of the things we're doing is trying to put a lot of the information that we have, on what from a staff perspective are sort of very curated student success guides and web pages that make a lot of sense from a staff perspective, but students often find quite bewildering and don't really know where to start, or don't really even know what question they're supposed to be asking. So we've been working to sort of support sort of chatbots so students can ask kind of quite general questions, and then get so rather than it being sort of an open LLM that's going to give them really generic answers about higher education, it's actually fed into the Imperial systems themselves so that it leads them directly to the services that we provide as an institution for our students. And points them, to which building and which office, for example, the disability advice service would be for them to go to and chat with a member of staff, or direct links to institutional resources to help support them in their student experience. We've got a lot of really positive feedback about this because it's how a lot of students are engaging with their learning now. And I do want to give us plenty of time for chat, but I'm just going to close with kind of updating a really interesting project that I'm undertaking that I think might be interesting for you to reflect on. What does this look like in your context? So I recently received funding from a partnership Imperial has with a global hub based in India. So a colleague and I who's at IIT Delhi. And this colleague and I are really interested in not kind of a lot of the ways higher education researchers are exploring how students use AI, what they learn, if they use it for assessments, are they cheating, but we're more fundamentally interested in how is it impacting on their collaboration and belonging as students? Because as I mentioned, going back to those first principles, we know collaboration is key for sort of student success, but what does it mean when you've got a sort of chatbot on your laptop that seems to have all the answers? And what we've heard from research is a lot of students feel like the chatbots they use or that they develop and sort of customize, they feel like it's their friend, like it's their coach. They can have it ask them questions. They almost use it as a like digital version of flashcards in different ways. But it's important to think about, well, what does this mean in relation to how students maybe used to do some of that activity with other students? And we know that's really important. So how does this change how they're engaging in their higher education experience and how they reflect on their fellow students and who they sort of feel their peers are? And are there consequences for how they're thinking about their higher education experience and some of those soft skills we know are really important for them to take into the workplace? So we're exploring sort of the ethical dimension, the belonging dimension, how they engage with other students. Is this, engaging with AI something, my assumption going in is a bit like it's something you do alone in your bedroom and you don't really talk to other students about how you're using it or what you're doing with it, or is there something that you would maybe still have that traditional view of 4 students around a table in the library, but with a laptop open to ChatGPT that would be engaging with them and providing some reflective answers? Or is there sort of this sense that a lot of students feel like they're not supposed to be using it, or they're not sure how they're supposed to be using it? So they end up shutting down those opportunities to engage with other students and take advantage of what AI offers them. How do we think about the inclusive dimension? Who has access? How do they know how to use it? And also the cognitive dimension. I overheard some students chatting on the bus. This is a brilliant way to do informal research, saying that they were only sort of reading article summaries, but the problem was the article summaries included words they didn't know because they hadn't actually read the article that defined the terms within it. So they said their learning was becoming really superficial because they kind of felt like they could get the general gist of things, but they were sort of lacking some of that fundamental understanding of what they were supposed to be getting out of what they're reading. So what we're going to be doing in this project over the next year is develop some case scenarios of how students could use AI and some hackathons with students at both Imperial and IIT Delhi to develop some ideas and solutions for some of the different scenarios for engaging with AI. And think about how students can then write up these case studies to support students more widely and use this as a resource for teachers more broadly. And I'd like you to reflect on this and how you think students might be using some of these tools in relation to the courses you use, and how do we go beyond kind of concerns about students' approach to assessment and are they cheating and am I just marking AI written essays, to think about how they're actually using it in relation to their learning. And I know there's quite a lot of STEM academics, and I did want to share this resource with you. So this is a recent book that we put out with chapters from a number of colleagues at Imperial, but also colleagues at other institutions. And this was exploring these concepts of belonging and identity, specifically within the STEM higher education subject. So it's a collection of edited chapters, and it's open access, published through UCL Press. You can use this QR code and you can download a free copy PDF of the book. And it might be interesting, there's a couple subject-specific chapters within there that might be relevant to your own context, as well as some broader topics looking at diverse students and also some alternative ways of thinking about belonging with students. And I sort of make an argument that actually how students think and know things in STEM context can be a fundamental form of belonging for them. And that actually what their connection with each other is a sort of shared mindset. and often quite logical and analytical way of thinking. And that if we support that, that can leave a lot of students thinking belonging might not necessarily be all having the same drink at a nightclub. It might actually be sharing some solutions to a problem on a chalkboard, and actually that gives them a really strong sense of belonging. They might not even need to be talking while they do it, but it's that idea of being in a shared space. So I think if we think about belonging in really holistic and open ways, it really opens up ways to connect our higher education to our students in relation to the lives that they're living today. So as I finish on pretty much every single presentation I ever get, I encourage you to engage your students when you think about the education that you're in partnership with them for. So it's really important for us to think about challenging students and setting that high bar of expectations, but also providing support for students so that they just don't feel overwhelmed. We need to inform students about what's going on and the choices we make in relation to their educational experience, and seek, ask, and report on feedback that we get from them. We need to provide opportunities for students to engage in their learning and on the course themselves, and hold students responsible for their end of this, sort of engagement pact. Very much having this idea of working with and not for students when we think about higher education. So just to mention, the project that I did on educational gains was in partnership with a whole host of institutions, and they like me to mention this every time I reference the project. And here's some more resources if you'd like to learn more specifically about educational gain. And the slides will be shared with you so that you can access these later on if you haven't been able to capture them now. And I will stop there and stop sharing my screen and take some time for questions. Thank you very much.